Oh, only one, I'm sorry. It's my free speech expression. I would clap more.
All right, so I'm Ann Price, and I'm Associate Professor of Sociology, and I wanted to welcome you to our College of Humanities and Social Sciences seminar series, and not just to our first presentation today, but to the series as a whole. So it's going to have a variety of different presentation styles and a variety of different topics, but all of the presentations, the goal is that they'll all be relevant to the local community in some way, and we hope to have a lot of collaboration. So we hope to have speakers from across our VSU community, staff, students, and faculty. And then we also would like to have organizational leaders and community members. So I hope as you're watching today, you're also thinking about what you would like to speak about in the series. We actually have 2 presentations this April, so I had flyers outside for both of those. Today we have 3 of our VSU faculty and staff, and I know that I'm going to leave their introductions for them. And then on April 25th, we have Joe Robbins, the head of the Political Science Department, along with Brandy Dame, who is the Valdosta Main Street Program Director, and Tracy Washington, a student in political science, and they'll be talking about their the student's capstone project, which was a development of downtown Adel. So I hope you'll come back for that one on April 25th. And now we'd like to hear from our panelists on academic freedom and free speech on campus.
All right. Thank you very much. This is fantastic to see this many people here. And can everybody hear me? You can hear us? All right. I'm the sort of moderator of this, although I'll be chiming in and playing devil's advocate. My name is Adam Wood. I'm the head of the Department of English. You might think, why are you up here? My former institution, I just came here in July. At my former institution, I was the long-term chair of the Academic Freedom and Tenure Committee. And so I have long had a very strong dedication to academic freedom. But I am also, and I like to make this joke, one of the last of the liberals who is a absolutist on free speech. There are a number of us, but not many people want to admit to it anymore. So I'm in the strange position of being hated by everybody, which I kind of embrace. I will introduce our guest in just a second, but I wanted to kind of set up some of the issues, some of the concerns that we have. So I want to start with a handful of examples. At Yale University, just recently, supposedly progressive law students derailed a discussion about a student who was prohibited from sharing his faith on campus and the larger issue of free speech zones on college campuses because the event was sponsored by a conservative group. One protester reportedly screamed at one panelist, pardon my language here, but it's free speech, "I will literally fight you, bitch." Right? These are law students who were saying this, just kind of keep that in mind. A university, I know, that's kind of the worst part, so I had to reinforce that.
How eloquent.
I know. A University of Delaware adjunct professor was fired for a pair of offensive Facebook posts about Otto Warmbier. I don't know if people remember him. The young man who was in North Korea, took down a propaganda poster, was found guilty for it, was in prison for a year, became so sick and he was released and he died shortly after he came back to the United States. The professor posted that Warmbier was, quote, a clueless white male, end quote, who, quote, got what he deserved. Conservative pundits cited this an example of left-wing academics imposing their politics on their students. A public lecture at MIT on climate and the potential for life on other planets was canceled after a so-called Twitter mob, I'm using the quotes on that, demanded the speaker be disinvited because he had expressed elsewhere a belief that higher education's increasing focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, quote, violates the ethical and legal principle of equal treatment of individuals, end quote, and he proposed instead merit, fairness, and equality, so MFE instead of DIE, whereby university applicants, quote, are treated as individuals and evaluated through a rigorous and unbiased process based on their merit and qualifications alone. I got a number of these, so bear with me. A white professor at the University of Southern California was removed from his classroom, he was a business professor, for saying a Chinese word that sounds like an English language racial slur, the N-word. Multiple other professors at multiple other universities have been punished for reading that same word out loud in discussions of legal or literary texts where quoting a word has been equated to using a word. Next up, faculty who are reported on by the right-wing website Campus Reform, anybody ever heard of Campus Reform? Are regularly targeted with threatening emails and voice messages. The primary topics of faculty speech that led to Campus Reform stories are race, politics, and gender sexuality. Numerous states, including our own, have introduced so-called divisive concept bills. I assume most of us have heard about this going on, which seek to ban the teaching of critical race theory, amongst a couple of other things. Federally funded campuses, including our own, I want to kind of have fun with this, regularly violate the First Amendment right to free speech by imposing free speech zones out of a desire to protect students from harmful speech. Did you all know that about VSU? There is a free speech zone that is actually in violation of federal law. This is but a handful of campus-related incidents connected to issues of academic freedom and free speech in just the last few years. To suggest that there is a culture war over academic freedom and free speech is not hyperbolic. While in the current moment, the right wing has control of the legal apparatus to silence speech, so for example, these anti-CRT laws, the left wing of politics has control of the cultural apparatus. Twitter, or what some people have called, anybody want to know what it is? Cancel culture. We've all heard the term, right? And both, I think, are equally dangerous in that they desire, above all, to limit what can, or perhaps what can't, be said. A recent survey conducted by the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, and if you've never heard of that organization, I strongly encourage everybody to look them up, shows that a majority of students on college campuses self-censor in class. They also support disinviting guest speakers they disagree with, and some of y'all might be thinking that right now with me. They also, though, don't know what speech is actually protected in the U.S. Constitution. Additionally, this survey found, results show that there is a partisan divide in attitudes towards free speech or free expression on campus. And interestingly, this divide has shifted in recent years. Whereas left-leaning individuals previously were the most ardent defenders of free speech, and we'll hopefully get into this, but one of the most powerful legal avenues during the civil rights movement were free speech arguments. Today, it is right-leaning individuals supposedly defending free speech, right? Now, we can make arguments, and we'll hopefully hash this out in some ways, about the weaponizing of free speech, but we'll get to that. So, to discuss with me the current crises, and I use that word very purposely, of academic freedom and free speech in higher education are Sandra Y.G. Jones, did I get that right?
That's
all right, thank you. And Peggy Moch. Sandra Jones, LMSW, sorry, some of them, GCDF, I don't know quite what those mean.
We'll talk about
All right. Is Director of Student Diversity and Inclusion at Valdosta State University. Sandra earned 2 Bachelor of Arts degrees in Sociology and Anthropology, Sociology and Anthropology, and Philosophy and Religious Studies. She also earned her Master of Social Work from Valdosta State University and currently is in the Doctorate of Higher Education program. Ms. Jones served as Curriculum Developer and Corporate Diversity Inclusion Training Facilitator. That's a long title.
It is. It doesn't mean a lot of money, though.
Yeah, the longer the title, the shorter the paycheck. For South Florida People of Color, conducting diversity and inclusion workshops, retreats, webinar trainings, and customized services to assist clients with inclusive excellence. Is it Sandra? Am I getting that right? Sandra, I'm sorry. Sandra travels nationally and is a sought-after speaker on topics of diversity, equity, and inclusion, leadership, and faith. So it's pretty obvious why I wanted her to join us here. Dr. Peggy L. Moch, did I get that right? All right. Is a former inner-city high school mathematics teacher from Orlando, Florida, and a professor of mathematics here at VSU, where she teaches a variety of undergraduate and graduate mathematics education courses in face-to-face and online classes. Dr. Moch graduated with a PhD in 2002 from the University of Central Florida in Orlando, Florida. Boy, we can have some conversation about Orlando and free speech issues right now. We'll get to that, perhaps. Yes, where she was awarded the Order of Pegasus Award. That sounds like some secret society. The highest award given to students for academic excellence, research, and service to the university and the community. She is a past international president of Kappa Delta Pi, International Honor Society in Education, and a current American Association of University Professors member. And this is kind of the key why she was invited tonight. And current VSU chapter president. Her research interests are in pre-service teacher mathematics self-efficacy, mathematics anxiety, motivational theory, and using technology in the classroom. She is currently co-authoring the second edition of an early childhood education mathematics content textbook for Kendall Hunt Publications. So the short version is, Sandra is here for the free speech part, and Peggy is here for the academic freedom part. I want to thank you both for being here. Very much appreciated. So I want to start with free speech since it is the broader category in some ways. And I would like to ask Sandra if you could give us a brief overview of what the First Amendment protects and what it does not protect.
Okay. That's, again, pretty simple. It's right there in the, I didn't know if you were going to have it to read or not, but I won't read it. But basically, we have 5 protections, okay? You have the protection of course, freedom of speech, religion. You have the freedom of to assemble, the freedom of the press, and to petition. So those are the things that the amendment actually protects. We always talk about the protections, but some of the things we rarely talk about are the exemptions. And I think that we miss the exemptions because they're difficult to really kind of figure out what's the standard. They're kind of broad. It can be a bit vague in interpretation. For instance, incitement, that's an exception. It is not protected by First Amendment. So you may ask the question, what's incitement, right? Because you can incite me, and it may not meet the standard of the Supreme Court to be considered not protected. Fighting words, again, very subjective. Because what you find to be fighting words, I may not. And then the question becomes, who is the arbitrator of what's fighting words? And I think even in situations on our campus, there's a lot of fighting words going on. And as I stand there in our freedom or public forum zones, when these things are happening, it's definitely, to me, insightful, and there are fighting words. But again, we don't often reach that standard. Obscenity. Then there's defamation. Commercial speech, and then what's called considered compelling interest of government. So those are the things that are not protected, but again, there's a pretty high threshold in order to reach that, or that for that speech to rise to the occasion to be considered non-protected speech.
And you mentioned obscenity, right? The classic definition of obscenity that has been used is I don't know how to define it, but I know it is when I see it, right?
Right.
So you think about something like pornography, right? When does pornography go so far as to reach a First Amendment violation? And again, it's a very, very sort of slippery slope with that, right?
So there has to be 3 areas met for obscene, for something to be considered obscene. According to a case that's called Miller versus the state of California. And those three kind of standards are, to the average person, applying contemporary community standards appeal to prurient interest, number 1. Number 2, depict or describe in a patently offensive way sexual conduct as specifically defined by the applicant state law. And number 3, taken as a whole lack in serious literary, artistic, political, and scientific value. Now again, that's pretty broad, because how are you going to tell me something that's not artistic? How can you define that for me as the artist to be considered obscene? And so, again, and you have to reach all three. It can't be one or the other. You have to meet all three in order for it to be considered obscene. So hardcore pornography may not be considered obscene if it doesn't reach all three of those.
And interesting, you point out the sort of language of contemporary community standards, right? What would be considered obscene pornography in 1970 is pretty tame, perhaps, by today's standards,
Absolutely.
right? The flips,
Or
well, in a flip side sort of way, do we run certain risks of applying contemporary standards to previous pieces of art or pieces of speech, right? What offends us now was not considered offensive then, and so we think about the time gap that often can even complicate this even more.
Yeah, I think not just the time gap, but when you start looking at generationally, right? Again, I was not always aware of what was going on in the 70s, but I was born around 1975.
That's the same year I was born.
But in that space, in that space though, there is this idea of not just the generation. I can be pretty offended by some things that happen, with our millennials, our Zers, our Xers, and although I may be offended by it, I still fight for their ability to express themselves the way they express. I don't have to agree, or I don't have to be in line with their ideology in order to defend their right to express it.
Okay.
So even when it comes down to conversation, you mentioned the professor that was cited for saying a word that sounded very similar to the N-word.
Right.
That becomes a huge conversation, right? That becomes like, well, if you say it amongst yourselves when you're talking about the black community or African Americans, why is it offensive when someone else says it?
Right.
But there are things that are intra-group that don't belong in other groups' mouths. But if you say it, can you express that? Can you say it? Absolutely, yeah, you say it, fine. But then does that now elevate that speech to fighting words because you don't understand what it means when it comes from someone else? So you have a right to your freedom of speech, but be ready for the consequences that may happen behind that.
That's right, and I think that's a great
And that's
point,
a space we don't talk about, the
Right,
consequences.
right.
You may not get arrested, and you have a right to say it, but you might get punched in the mouth. And again, I am not advocating violence in that space, but it is a consequence. You may say something at work that caused you to lose your job. You had the right to say it and the freedom to say it, but the consequences behind what you say, you have to be prepared for your mouth. You have to be prepared to follow the consequences behind the speech that you have a right to say. So I advocate all day, say what you're going to say. However, don't jump into these are my rights when the consequences come that you didn't expect.
And you key on a really important thing here, right? That the First Amendment protects free speech from being censored by the government, not by others reacting against you, right? And so that there is that sort of key difference. One thing that you left out in terms of the restriction of free speech is hate speech, right? Okay. Which again is a very amorphous sort of term. And many young people, at least, perhaps others, believe that hate speech is illegal speech, right? Is not protected,
speech.
Right?
It is protected.
Could you talk about why it is, not your opinion, but why under the First Amendment protections, hate speech is protected speech? Again,
hate speech really kind of goes back into that space of what someone may find hateful, someone else may not. And that speech is protected. So that's why when we're on campuses and you run up on people who have who say racial slurs or are homophobic and say things that are just objectionable, in that space, their right to say it is protected. Okay. Unfortunately, what ends up happening is, and I won't even say it's unfortunate because we are in a space and time now where I think people coming into their identities and understanding who they are. And sometimes it has taken so much to just be accepted for who I am. And I'm accepting it, and I want other people to accept and respect it. right? So that becomes a space now when I see someone standing, operating in their free speech, and it's become objectable to who I am, I don't think it should happen, right? Because I don't agree with what you're saying. But here it is. Free speech was such a huge tool for various marginalized groups. But let's just take, for example, the civil rights movement. It was essential for that conversation and the speech that went into what activists were saying, not just for civil rights movement, for the LGBTQ plus movement, for indigenous peoples movement, to be able to get out and say what was necessary and what was truth for that group, although people outside of that group may not have agreed with it, right? But their ability to activate that tool led to people being made aware, also people coming into support, and then ultimately changes in laws and changes in our society. So it's very important that we not go down this kind of, it's two-sided for me, because I think you can't go down the slippery slope of wanting to petition everything and say this can't happen. Because now, and even on our campus, when they say let's sign a petition for this not to happen, and then you graduate and you're gone. So when the next group comes and they want this right, it's hard now because you fought for it not to happen, and we can say, well, students didn't want that. Now it's a real kind of crazy space. But at the same time, I don't have to agree with you. And I think we're in a space now where people just want everybody to agree. And it is our differences where the conflict happens, where we learn things and the rubber kind of hits the road. Let's disagree and kind of come to a place where we have at least some semblance of understanding. But we don't do that now, right? So it's just, nope, you're wrong. I don't agree with that. So let's get rid of it. That's not a world we should want to live in. It's about diversity to me.
It's interesting. You kind of hinted one of the issues, right, around free speech is how we define that, right? Is one of the challenges of that, right, that we can think of obvious examples of free speech, right? Some Nazi skinhead comes on campus and says minorities are inferior to whites, right? We recognize that very quickly. Is one of the challenges with hate speech sort of where we draw that line? Right? So if someone else says that, someone else looks at crime rates and says crime is higher in certain communities, right? And they want to view it a certain way that does not consider perhaps systematic racism or structural, right? Is that, how do we tease out the difference between those different types of speech? Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think you're kind of moving into some of the academic stuff too, because there are things that I think when people make these types of comments that I can prove. Okay, number one, I just had this discussion the other day with a group of people. This idea that African American fathers are not in the home, right? Okay. This is a huge stereotype. When you look statistically, though, it shows you about 59% of fathers that are African Americans are in the home. But you would think that this kind of, black families don't have daddies, right? Like 90%, 99.9%, and it's false. But you have people that perpetuate this conversation as if, poor black folk don't have fathers in the home, and it's just not accurate. Or the fact that fathers in the home, I may have my father in my life, doesn't mean that he's laying down in the house that I'm laying down in, but he's an influence in my life. It's this idea that continues to get perpetuated, right? Without kind of the information to back it up. It's just this stereotype that continues to keep going, and no one corrects it. But if you say it as a professor in a classroom, because you are a professor, it gives some level of validity to something that's not accurate. And once that is kind of in someone's mind, students run and go, your daddy's not in the house. And you're looking at them like, but statistics, no, but my professor said. Is that academic freedom? And do we allow that academic freedom just because it's in the academy, although it's rooted in falsehood and ignorance? Do you have a right to just spew stuff out because it's a stereotype that you didn't seek out yourself, right, under the guise of academic freedom?
Which again shows how difficult that distinction is.
It's a line now.
Why do you think that the current generation of students are more resistant to absolute free speech than perhaps previous generations? Because, and to sort of preface that, a number of sort of studies have been done that show that current generations of students, this current generation of students, are less open to freedom of speech in some ways than perhaps previous generations were. Why do you think that is?
Again, I can just give my opinion on that. I really just think it goes back to this idea of acceptance and respect. It takes so long to just come to this realization of who people are, who you are. And this, think about it, in past generations, there were not even words to describe some different identities that people struggle with. Now we've given voice, we've given words. That's why I can't stand when people don't use proper words. What's the deal with pronouns? Use the pronoun, people. Use it, because it's giving a person an identity. It's like me saying, okay, Mr. Gray Shirt with the stripes, I totally invalidate
That's actually his name.
Right? I totally invalidate his identity and his existence by refusing to use what I know would bring him affirmation. Why would I do that? Mm-hmm. Right? And because I think this generation has fought so long and so hard for that affirmation, when anyone comes in and tries to obstruct that, or it becomes this, I'm finally free and I'm living in my freedom, and here you come trying to, cut it off or say that there's something wrong with that, they're going to fight back. So they're not seen, I don't think it's being seen as a freedom of expression. It's being seen as a protection of an identity, protecting who I am versus fighting freedom of expression. Because they've come for years on our campus, right?
You're talking the preachers that were there before.
The preachers come for years on our campus. But again, for 2 years, we've really been without them because of COVID. So you have students who are juniors now who have never experienced mayhem. They've never experienced some of the stuff that's great about our campus, and they've never experienced this stuff. And so they hear this, and it's like, oh, what? Wait a minute, not on my campus, I pay tuition, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, you're right, but they have a right to do that. So we had to realize there was a gap of education because we took for granted it's not been experienced, so it's not, we just left. That's not something we think about. We've been trying to get y'all to have class, so we weren't thinking about the preachers.
It's funny, you mentioned COVID, right, where we spent so much time online, right? Is the online existence part of the complication, right? That we think about our lives online, where it's very easy for us to get sort of siloed in, right?
Absolutely.
To only hear what we agree with, to only read things that sort of feed our own beliefs.
That confirmation bias,
right? Right,
yeah.
Exactly. Is that one of the issues, perhaps, that the current generation of students, or perhaps all of us post-COVID, have not had the experience of actually being confronted with things that we strongly disagree with, and having to perhaps say, well, I don't have to listen to that, right? Because one of the other aspects of the First Amendment is I have the freedom not to listen to that. I have the freedom to walk away. Exactly, right? Is the internet culture in which we are all immersed at this point complicating, if not really frustrating, some of these discussions?
I think somewhat it is, because we're losing just soft skills, right? Just the ability to have a conversation. Talking to a student saying, well, did you speak for that professor? Well, I text them. And the professors, we trying to become all things to all students. You put your cell phone number on your syllabus so they can call or text, and they normally text, and you're looking at it like, God, why did they text me? Then there's this miscommunication, right? Because again, I'm reading it based on my lens, not necessarily how the student read. So if you think something was said that was disrespectful and the student didn't mean it that way, and then forget auto text, so autocorrect. But no, I do. We are losing FaceTime with people. We're losing that. I would rather you sit and talk with me because I'm going to feel something from you differently than I'm reading in a digital world, right? So online is just, and it's made it more dependent than this intercommunal type of relationship that you think you should have on a college campus. And yeah, that has complicated it. But how do you? There has to be this balance, though, of moving with what's new and what's the new technology and everything, the direction that we're going, but still having FaceTime. So in student affairs, we try to encourage the FaceTime, right? And students are asking, well, is it going to be online? And I'm like, no, you got to show up. So yeah, I think that is difficult because people have what I call keyboard courage.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, you'll say things on keyboard, online, and in your text messages that you won't say in somebody's face. And number two, it never stops. So when I was bullied, very rarely, but when I was, I could go home and it ended. Now with online and social media, it never stops. People can be bullying you at 2 o'clock in the morning because it's on social media, right? And you don't stop. It's like you're drawn to, I wonder what they said. And it just never ends. So yeah, you have the freedom to express it, but you're now always inundated with this negativity. And it becomes, wow. So when you finally decide you're gonna fight back, again, I really don't believe it's about the freedom of speech. It's more or less about you're attacking me and who I am. So yeah, I'm gonna fight back.
All right.
Well, for all of my students, I just want to say I don't get those pictures, don't send them.
Well, thank you for jumping in, because I want to shift sort of to academic freedom, right, which is connected, but in some ways very different. Peggy, could you sort of define the tenets of academic freedom?
All right, well, I am, as we said in the introduction, I'm the campus president for the American Association of University Professors, which in some states is a union, but not in the state of Georgia. And so I'm just going to give the AAUP definitions for these things because they're quite well stated and they've been vetted by over 250 national scholarly organizations and education associations. I'll just tell them we're busy. Academic freedom is the freedom of a teacher or researcher in higher education to investigate and discuss the issues of his or her academic field and to teach or publish findings without interference from political figures, boards of trustees, donors, or other entities. Academic freedom also protects the right of a faculty member to speak freely when participating in institutional governance, as well as to speak freely as a citizen. And then these are broken down into 4 distinct areas. So we have, for teaching, is the freedom to discuss all relevant being the key word here, matters in the classroom. It isn't to discuss anything you want, it has to be relevant matters. So as fun as all of this topic is for this evening, we're not going to probably talk about it in college algebra Thursday morning because it's not relevant to that classroom. According to AAUP policies, freedom to teach includes the right of the faculty to select materials, determine the approach to the subject, make assignments, and assess student academic performance in teaching activities, and for which the faculty member is individually responsible. And faculty members are also entitled to the freedom in the classroom of discussing their subject, but they should be careful not to introduce into their teaching controversial matters which are unrelated to their subject, or to persistently introduce material which has no relation to the subject, except for my bunny rabbit jokes.
That's actually written in the policy.
Yeah. So this doesn't mean teachers should avoid all controversial materials as long as the material stimulates debate and learning that is germane to the subject matter is protected by freedom in the classroom. All right? So can you do whatever you want in your classroom? Up to a point. But and there are more restrictions, and we'll get to those. So research is freedom to explore all avenues of scholarship, research, and creative expression, and to publish results of such work. According to AAP, faculties are entitled to full freedom in research and publication of results. Freedom in research is important, but it's a common misconception that academic freedom is primarily freedom of research. This misconception is reinforced by tying the awarding of tenure to research accomplishments and by appointing non-tenure track contingent faculty members to teaching only positions. Intramural speech. So speech freedom from institutional censorship or discipline when speaking or writing as participants in the governance of an educational institution. So, for instance, when I was president of the Faculty Senate, I had the right to say the things that we needed to say during those meetings and to conduct those meetings in a manner and saying things that were of interest to faculty and reporting things as long as they're done in a civil manner, let's say. So, and then for faculty members must be free to speak truthfully and factually, and in order to protect academic freedom and academic quality in the institution, faculty must participate in governance. Shared governance is an important attribute at this university and well supported by our administration, I'm grateful to say. Extramural speech. Freedom from institutional censorship or discipline when speaking or writing as citizens. This is arguably the most controversial and challenged aspect of academic freedom, as it does not necessarily relate to disciplinary expertise. The AUP policies call for faculty members to be free from institutional censorship or discipline when they speak or write as citizens, but they also impose special obligations. When speaking on public matters, faculty should strive to be accurate, should exercise appropriate restraint, should show appropriate respect for the opinions of others, and should make every effort to indicate that they are not speaking for the institution. I can have my opinion, I can write an editorial, and I can sign my name on it, but I have to include in there that I am not speaking for the university, that this is my personal opinion, and that in no way reflects the policies of administration or whatever. There's only one person at the university who can speak for the university. Anybody know who it is? The president. And that's it. And he can delegate to others that authority, but nobody else is allowed to speak for the university, only the president. Okay?
I appreciate you clarifying for that, and I should say I do not speak for the university tonight. We may get to a point where that becomes relevant, so I wanted to put it out there now. So again, it's interesting you set up some key differences between free speech as protected by the First Amendment and academic freedom, right, as protected by the AUP sort of bylaws. Is there something about academic freedom that you think students misunderstand most?
Well, I think that students don't understand that academic freedom doesn't mean I get to do anything I want in my classroom. I'm not allowed, and just to give the classic math example, I'm not allowed to get up there and teach 4 + 3 is 8. Because it's inaccurate, it's inappropriate, and whatever. The other limitations that faculty have also is from the collective, which is the other people in your discipline that are your peers that have dictated the standard for the profession. And you have to meet that standard. If you fall below it, or say 4 + 3 is 8, things like that, you're going to get censured by the collective and be in trouble that way. That's free speech. Yep, you got to say that and whatever, but it's not going to fly. And I don't think that students necessarily understand that. They also don't understand that because of the collective, like in our department, we decide as a group what texts we're going to use, what types of software we're going to use, which sections in books that we're going to teach for a particular course, especially in sequential courses where it matters what gets covered to moving on so that other people already have it. And I'm sure it's not just mathematics and language and other places. That's important so that as you go from one course to the next, you've met the prerequisite. That prerequisite actually gives you the understanding that you need to move on to that next course in the discipline. And so while I have autonomy in my classroom and free speech and things that I can do, I am bound by what the collective has dictated for that in my classroom. I don't get to pick when the final is. I don't get to pick when the midterm is. I don't get to pick when grades are due. I don't get it, I didn't make the policy on incompletes. I have to follow the policy on incompletes. I have to have my grades in by a certain day and time, or I have to do enough paperwork to want to hurt myself if I don't. Because it's a separate piece of paper for every individual student that has to be countersigned by your department head, who no longer love you either. So then there are these many things that faculty members are restricted by within the academy that, you think, well, you can just do whatever you want. No, I really can't. I have to follow the guidelines of my discipline. I have to follow the guidelines from my department and those things, and I have to meet those things and in order to get things to move as a unit.
And I appreciate the sort of clarity of that. As I try to sort of set up with the examples that I cited at the beginning, there are attacks on academic freedom that are coming from both the sort of what we might call the politically left and politically right, right? Again, anti-CRT bills coming from the politically right, where there is, and I'm using this term sort of in air quotes, sort of an overly woke attack that often comes at academic freedom, sort of limiting what professors can talk about, sort of suggesting that certain topics shouldn't be discussed because they might be triggering. I don't know if folks have heard terms like trigger warnings and safe spaces, right, and these kind of things. What do you see as the biggest threats to academic freedom in the contemporary moment?
Well, there are a lot of things that have recently happened in the Georgia legislature that have limited or hindered what's going on in the K-12 classrooms. Anything that happens in K-12 is bound to affect higher ed at some point or another. Whether it is used as a stepping stone, if we did it for K-12 and what's good for the goose is good for the gander, and so now we're going to do the same thing to higher ed, or that those students coming up will no longer have the experiences that we previously expected them to have, and when they get to higher ed, then their foundation isn't as strong as what it had been previously. Case in point would be House Bill 1084, which is prohibition against teaching critical race theory. And it's important to understand that critical race theory is a topic that's taught in law school. We don't offer it here. We don't offer it in K-12, but it's no longer allowed to be taught in K-12, which is good because they didn't anyway. Never did. It's like, okay, so this was more of a political statement because it's an election year than it was about this is what's going on in these classrooms, because this is a law school class that people take that's, yeah.
But I think the danger in that though, Peggy, is that people are trying to, they're calling it CRT, but they're coming after history.
Yes.
And you can't merge the two.
Yeah.
So yeah, they're and purposely, it's trying to make it convoluted. So I can't teach history now of things without this kind of new legislation being pushed and saying, well, you can't teach that to my child because they're triggered. Well, I'm not about to jump off in the pool. But go ahead. I'm sorry.
Okay. We got time. I'll get the diving board set up for you.
I'm sorry.
So there's also House Bill 1178 and Senate Bill 226. The House bill gives parents the total control over curriculum in public schools. And the Senate bill allows parents to select the textbooks. Well, I want you to know that's been a tedious job. I taught high school, and that is a tedious job to go through all those books. Y'all have fun. Because that's a miserable job to do, to go through the books and to look at them and to review, and it takes a lot of time, and thanks for taking that off our hands in education. Right? Those don't directly affect higher education, but anything that can happen in K-12 can happen in higher ed, if not now, then later. And because of that, National AAUP has now decided to partner with the American Federation of Teachers in an effort to help fight these attacks against education on all levels. Then there's also a Senate Bill 319, which I thought was most interesting after all the things that we had with campus carry, and you had to have a concealed weapons. Yeah, no, not anymore. No longer, you can apply for that if you like, because then it's transferable to other states, but you don't have to if you don't want to. So it's like, okay, my goodness. Yeah, so interesting things that are happening. Those are things that are current things that are right now happening. Those bills have gone to the governor. I don't know if the governor signed them or not, but legislation session just recently finished, like last week, and those went to the governor. Whether he signs them or not is yet to be seen, but certainly a distinct possibility. There was a lot of lobbying on the part of AAUP members and others to try to, how shall we say, bring some sense to this, but was unsuccessful. Unsuccessful at this point, so now it's wait and see what the governor decides to do with it.
I had a couple of more questions that were going to be slightly more offensive, but for the sake of time, we only have about 10 minutes left, and I wanted to make sure that there were opportunities for questions. So again, if you want to get an offensive answer or a question, then now's the time. But yeah, I just want to kind of throw it out there. Please.
I have a question because literature, teaching literature, English literature, seems to break both boundaries. Academic speech, what is appropriate to speak about in a literature classroom? And I'm teaching Toni Morrison, for example. Am I allowed to say the N-word because she uses it or not? You know, sometimes I just pass it over to some other student to read instead of me. Can you read that out loud for us? But no, I mean, seriously, and I've had students complain that I'm using that by not censoring Toni Morrison. And I'm not going to censor Toni Morrison. She put it in there, she can use it, right? But at the same time, she raises issues that don't sound relevant to people in a classroom, but it's a literature class. And so where does relevant come down here?
So relevant, again, comes from the, get the right word for this, because I'm always, the collective, right? So
Right.
your discipline makes that as
We don't pick our textbooks in literature at higher ed. He cannot tell me what to teach in my classroom.
It's true,
Neither can the
and
collective, 'cause they
nor
don't
would I
teach.
try.
But I mean, there's still standards within your discipline.
It depends on how you look at that. I teach British
Everything,
literature of a certain
well,
era.
I'm sure that there is grammar that wouldn't apply.
Well,
There's.
no, not really, Peggy. I'm sorry, but
Oh my
no.
Well,
Literature.
Spelling counts still, right?
Well, the grammar itself, that
In a
standardized
literary
grammar
text,
thing,
right,
that
students still have to use
standardized grammar
grammar
thing is
correctly,
itself
yeah,
racist.
yeah.
And sexist, quite frankly, as
Yeah,
well.
probably.
But yeah, the idea that there's one standard grammar, no, there's a whole lot of English grammar. But I don't teach grammar anyway. I teach literature.
Okay, so
So,
the
digressing in the
discipline
grammar would be
itself has no
violating.
standard.
what?
The discipline, literature, and all of the people that go to those different things, et cetera. It's not my discipline, so I'm
Right.
not really.
No, but yeah, we don't have any, we have, right now we're in curriculum reform, we don't even have those.
Well,
We
but
have-
as a literature professor, I think it's an interesting tension, right? Is something like Toni Morrison, to use your example, right? Do I have academic freedom to teach Toni Morrison as long as that text is relevant to the course? So if it's an American literature course, obviously. If it's a course on issues of race and literature, obviously, right?
Women, gender studies.
Right, any number of
diversity
justifications for that course.
She's very relevant everywhere.
Whether I, as a professor, have the academic right, it's interesting, I had this conversation, are any of my students in here from this semester? No, that's really sad. It says, so, no, it's all right, it's all right. I'll punish them on Thursday when we have class. One of the discussions that we've had, right, is about the use of that word, right? Just this morning, we were reading a phenomenally beautiful but a phenomenally difficult short story by James Baldwin called Going to Meet the Man. If anyone's ever read this, it's phenomenal. If you haven't, you should. That word is used repeatedly and in different ways at different moments in the story. I have always taken the approach of telling students Baldwin is confronting us with this word and we have to do it, right? With that story. A few weeks ago, I taught a William Faulkner short story in which a character, Faulkner writes about a lot of sort of very white trash characters, like whatever. One of the characters in that story uses that word, but not in a way that requires us to confront it. So when I taught that short story, I didn't feel the need to lean into it, where with Baldwin, I made the very conscious decision and told them, here we go, right? Now, I am not a believer in trigger warnings by any stretch of the imagination, but at the same time, I have to admit, I told them, here we go, which is a trigger warning of sorts, right? That, I believe, very much is my academic freedom to make that decision, right? At the same time, and I think this goes to something that Peggy was saying, I also, as a faculty member, have a responsibility not to use it willy-nilly, and to help them understand the distinction between quoting it from a text and using it, right? And again, one of the examples that I cited earlier, I think a lot of times students, people in general, but students perhaps, misunderstand the difference between I am reading a text that is asking us to confront this and using a term, which are two very different things. But it requires us to have that conversation, I think, in the classroom. Just for the sake of time, there was another hand somewhere around in there. I saw it.
I think
Was it you? Hit me. All right, come on.
I was just going to say the gun bill already passed and signed by the governor.
Yeah, well,
Yeah, the
Okay.
gun bill's passed and signed.
It's
The
already
other
signed.
ones are still up for
Yeah.
signing.
Now, in some ways, the question is, how do we react to that?
scared.
Scared,
Just kidding. I'm not scared.
but at the same time, and this is a great example. Dr. Thompson is a tenured full professor, right?
More likely target.
But who is protected by tenure, right? We didn't get into tenure too much, but just sort of very quickly, tenure is a job protection for,
Not in Georgia anymore.
well, it is getting thinner and thinner, right? But you're right, it is interesting the ways in which this has become an issue that exists beyond the academy, right? The academy has, and it has been throughout time at different moments, become very politicized, right? In moments of culture war, in which we are in the midst, higher education becomes very often the center of it, right? We are the touchstone, I think, in many ways, of what is to come after that, right? Again, I can keep going on that. Are there other questions? We have 5 minutes left. Yes, sir.
I would love to hear you talk about House Bill 1, which eliminates or prohibits free speech zones on college campuses specifically, even though, as you previously stated, it's a violation of federal law. It remains to be seen if the governor will sign House Bill 1, but I would just like to hear you discuss that through the prism of the fact that BSU is not the only campus in the state of Georgia that has free speech zones.
Or in the United States. You're right. Do they have the free speech zones? It is interesting that as a federally funded university, other than in the classroom, basically, every inch of it's a free speech zone, right? That is simply the way that it is because it's a federally funded university. So anyone can walk anywhere on campus other than inside the classroom, in which faculty have academic freedom, and express their freedom, their right to free speech. So in some ways, I think it's a bit of window dressing, right, to sort of do this as a, look how tough we are on this. But again, I think it's an interesting consideration, right? One of the reasons that a lot of schools justify free speech zones is to limit your free speech, right? Is to limit what can be said and where, right? Now, for those of us who saw the preachers, is it a month ago now, I guess?
It's been ongoing since.
Well, the most recent ones, right? It was a month ago, right?
No, the most recent one was last week.
Oh, was they
We
back?
have one.
Oh, I didn't see them. I saw the one a month ago, right?
Yeah.
And they're-
If we disagree with the speech, right, we often think, great, they can only yap over there, right? If it's speech that we agree with, though, we're very quick to go, they should be able to say that anywhere, right? One of the classic sort of phrases about free speech is it's very easy to say free speech for me, but not for thee, right? The challenge of free speech, and again, I'm an absolutist, so this is just me, and I'm going to turn it to you all. The challenge of free speech is understanding the fact that as soon as you give an inch, even against those you disagree with, you start to give it all away. You give away their free speech, they're coming after yours next. It is inevitable, and you watch the process whereby democracies move into authoritarian states. That is always the first step. Every single time, that is the first step, right? This is why we have to, in my opinion, right, accept speech that we despise, and more importantly, protect speech that we despise, right? One of my favorite sort of sentiments about this is I despise what you say, but I will drop dead fighting for your right to say it, right? Because as soon as I let yours go, mine's coming right after. Now, that's my absolutist take, but I would ask my colleagues here at the table to weigh in as well.
For me, it's a combination of things. Again, I said it earlier, right? I don't have to agree with you, but I'll fight for your right to express. But I'm also, I'm here to also support the student body. And I can see during those public forum space times, students are just, they get excited, right? We had one occasion where the students have learned, because we did all this education out of my office about freedom of expression, blah, blah, blah. So the numbers were lower who showed up, and people were just walking away. I had one student who was a Jewish student say to me, Miss Sandra, I can't walk away. She says, that's how the Holocaust happened.
Yep.
She said, I can't walk away from this. I understood that, so I stood with her in that space and let her say whatever she needed to say back, right? But I understood that, so everyone is not going to walk away, right? But at the same time, it's hard for me as a student affairs professional to see a student get so excited that they may act out in a way where they end up having a conduct charge, or worse yet, a police escort off campus because they strike out because they're so incited, or they see things as fighting words. It's hard for me not to, I can lose my job by jumping in between the two, right? So that's the difficult space. So for me, although I agree with you, I think it is a way to take away someone's freedom of speech, but at the same time, for me, I have to vote on safety, because at least I know they're in this space. I can control this space, and I can have police in this space versus having a preacher here, one on down here, one over here, and all this is happening at one time because it's chaotic. I don't know if you've seen it and you've experienced it, but when we're in that small space of Palms Quad, and excuse me, but all hell is breaking loose, it is the scariest thing, because you don't know who has a gun. You don't know what's going on. A student, one student actually charged the stage one day, and he had his book bag, and I was just like, whoa, big fella. Hold on a minute. Let's not do, and it was frightening in the moment, because I knew I did not want this person in trouble. And I knew, because he said, I just can't stand it. I just need him to stop. I get it. But this is not the way we do it, right? So it's difficult, because I'm thinking about a 2-minute decision can ruin somebody's future. And then they're off this campus, they're in jail, something has happened over them not being able to hear what was going on consistently. I'm thinking about my staff. And the preacher will be back next week. So I'm looking at my staff, who are young professionals, just graduated from master's programs, who are there for 4 and 5 hours, because you can reserve that space from half an hour after we start to a half hour before we close. And they're sitting there hearing that all day. And I'm looking at them like, go take a break. Because you have to be both and, right? You got to be here as a professional, but I understand that you're a human being who's having trouble with this. I can't give them trigger warnings. I just have to look at them and say, walk off. But then I'm there. So then at 5 o'clock after they leave, I'm thinking, if they leave at 3, I'm leaving at 3:15. Because I have to regroup myself. So in my early 40s, and I'm struggling, what about an 18, 19, 17-year-old student? It's hard. But I think it's incumbent upon all of us to teach why this is important. It's, you know, we've done forums. You saw, we've done online forums. We have stuff on our website. It's important that you understand it because you have to understand what you're fighting for now and why it's important. As I see this as one of the cornerstones of our democracies for you to continue to fight in this generation for your voice. It's essential. So if we're not teaching that, then we're going to always have people who's going to give us the pushback, right? Use your identity. Use who you are to fight in this space for its protection.
Well, building off of that, hi, I'm your conservative person that's up here. And at the same point, though, while I may not agree or whatever, I fully and strongly believe that a liberal education must include things that make you uncomfortable. It must include things that make you uncomfortable and that you do not agree with. Otherwise, how do you know what things will make you uncomfortable and that you don't agree with? If everything
how to
goes
argue
along with
against those
everything
things.
you agree with, how do you know what you don't agree with and what you don't think is right or wrong? How do you get a lens? How do you justify what's right, what's wrong, etc.? You don't know. That's what a liberal education is supposed to do. It's supposed to provide you not just with things you like and agree with, like other classes besides math, or
I don't agree with math.
I don't either.
but it's okay.
I am a
I get that a lot.
That's why we sat next to each
I'm
other.
opposed to that.
I get that a lot, and you know, and I feel for you. But there are some of us that, well, we like it, and we like it all.
And you like it a lot.
Okay, and so, and that's important too, that you find that people, there are any topic that you can think of, someone is passionate about.
Yeah.
Someone is passionate about it. You don't have to agree with them. You don't have to agree with them, and you don't have to fight them because you don't agree with them. But if you're going to have a dialogue with them, let it be an educated dialogue. One that you have thought about thoughtfully and can have a dialogue. It doesn't have to. And if there are things that trigger you, there are things on campus that you can go and take care of those triggers with in an appropriate way. One of the things that I put in my notes, if I can find it back here, who knows where I made it go. When there are certain courses for triggers and like that. So like in my class, I'm probably not going to give you we're going to do differentiations today. That might be a trigger for you.
I would want that one.
All right. So that's probably not going to. But there's a class that's it's on human sexuality and sex deviations or something like that. It's a class that's taught by marriage and family therapy because you got to learn how to deal with that. I would imagine in that class they give you a lot of those trigger warning things. This may trigger you. If you need help with this topic or whatever, please go to so and so and get help with it. So some things have triggers and some things don't. But you know, we have to be in the moment and learn how to deal with things. And if it's something that is causing you personal trouble or whatever, talk to one of your professors, go and see a counselor, talk to one of your other friends or whatever. Don't let it eat you alive. But a liberal education is important. And a liberal education means that you're going to hear things that you don't agree with. You're going to hear things you do agree with. And that's what makes you a better overall person in our society and to help you to be more tolerant.
I think you're right. And I would add to that. A former colleague of mine used to say, even though in college you were confronted with things you disagree with and may disagree with vehemently, this is the safest space you're going to encounter. Because once you get out of here, they don't care that your feelings are hurt about something, right? This is the place to encounter it, to think about it, to engage with it, and to think about how you can respond to it. Because once you get out of here, nobody cares that you feel a certain way anymore, right? This is the safe space by definition, and it's a safe space to make mistakes. It's a safe space to try out new ideas, to test new ideas, to bang your ideas against others, and to have your ideas banged against by others, right? This is, in fact, by definition, the safest space there is, and any attempts to somehow soften it, to wrap us in bubble wrap, is simply dangerous and is not going to prepare you for the world.
I tell students all the time, this is your time to practice. You have 4 years to practice your adulting. Adulting sucks, but you have 4 years to practice that. And just because you agree with something that you hear doesn't make that something right. And just because you disagree with something doesn't make it wrong.
Right.
But you need to challenge your assumptions. And you're in a perfect place on college. You don't have to go anywhere else. Everything that you need to kind of, did you say, bang yourself up against,
of course,
is right here on campus, and you can learn some things, and you can challenge your assumptions, and it can happen, like you said, in a safe space. If there's going to be conflict, the perfect place for that to happen is at an institution of higher education. So you're supposed to be trying to pull me higher, right? Give me a greater perspective, expand my knowledge, challenge my assumptions. And this is the place to do that. If you leave the same way you came after 4 years, you missed it. You just gave us money. Thank you, though. That's my job. I appreciate
that's it. That's right. Now, we are almost 10 minutes over, but I will stay here and do this shit all night long. But, because I am. I think I didn't mean to get a little riled up. I'm sorry.
No,
But again, I know that folks have other things to do. But like dinner, yeah. This is a conversation that has to keep going on and on and on. And what makes me magically happy is that this room is full. This room is actually overfull.
And if you wish to be paid, you must sign.
Okay. But I will make this promise that if anybody wants to keep having this conversation, I will do this every single month until I drop dead if you want to. And I won't drag them into it.
I'm not going to stay.
I was going to say, no. Because this is, I very much believe, the freedom of expression is what's known as the eternally radical idea. And I believe that it's something that must be fought for every single day, over and over again if it has to. And if anybody wants to keep talking to me about it, I have an email, and I would love to keep doing it. And I want to thank my panelists for joining me. I thought this was fantastic. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
My students, when I talk about it, you talk about it again.
It was good.
No, that was killer.
Listen, anytime.
That was